You're watching a man who doesn't look like a superhero.
No cape. No flashy entrance.
No dramatic music playing in the background. He's just standing there in a plain gym, in a city most people couldn't point to on a map. And he starts moving. And the moment he starts moving, something shifts. Because what you're seeing doesn't look like training. It doesn't look like practice. It looks like something that was forged over years and years of pain, repetition, and obsession. It looks like a man who has done this so many times, so deeply, that his body no longer needs to think about what it's doing. Joe Rogan, a man who has interviewed world leaders, astronauts, scientists, comedians, and the most dangerous fighters on the planet, watched this footage.
And he couldn't speak.
He literally sat there, shaking his head, and said words that very few fighters ever get to hear from Joe Rogan. So the question is, what exactly did Islam Makhachev do that stopped Joe Rogan dead in his tracks? Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what that footage means, you first have to understand where Islam Makhachev came from. You have to understand the world he was born into.
The culture. The mountains.
The way of life that shaped everything about who he is inside that cage. Islam Makhachev was born in Makhachev, the capital city of Dagestan, a republic tucked into the southern edge of Russia, right at the edge of the Caucasus Mountains. Now if you've never heard of Dagestan, picture this. Rugged terrain. Cold winters. A deeply traditional culture where strength, discipline, and wrestling are not just sports, they are part of life itself. In Dagestan, wrestling is taught to boys almost as soon as they can walk. It's not a hobby. It's not something you do after school for fun. It is a way of life. It is tied to pride, to family, to community. To be a great wrestler in Dagestan is to be something close to royalty. And Islam Makhachev grew up right in the middle of all of that. But here's what made his story different from thousands of other Dagestani boys who wrestled. He grew up training alongside a kid named Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now if that name means nothing to you, stop everything. Because Khabib is widely considered the greatest mixed martial arts fighter who ever lived. He retired undefeated. 29 wins. 0 losses.
He didn't just beat his opponents. He crushed them.
He dominated them in a way that made experts rewrite what they thought was possible inside the UFC octagon.
And Islam Makhachev?
He trained with Khabib as a child. They grew up together.
They pushed each other.
They were shaped by the same coaches, the same gym, the same brutal standards that the Dagestan fighting system is known for. Think about what that means for a second. From the time Islam was a boy, his training partners included people who were being molded into some of the most dangerous athletes on the planet. Every day, he walked into a gym where mediocrity was not tolerated. Where showing up halfway was never an option. Where the culture itself demanded that you give everything, or go home. That pressure, that environment, that constant grind, it doesn't just make you better at fighting. It rewires your brain. It changes how you think about pain.
About fatigue.
About what your body is actually capable of. Islam absorbed all of it. And then he grew up, and he started fighting professionally, and people slowly started to realize, this man is not normal. His early UFC career was rocky. Not because he wasn't talented, but because he was young, still developing, dealing with injuries, finding himself. There were fights he didn't finish the way people expected. There were moments where critics wondered if he had what it took to reach the very top. But something was happening behind the scenes that the public couldn't see. He was training. Every single day. With a level of intensity that most professional athletes never come close to. And the man guiding that training, the man responsible for pushing Islam to heights that shocked even seasoned MMA analysts, was Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov.
Khabib's father.
A legendary coach who built an entire system of fighters from Dagestan that changed the sport forever. Abdulmanap didn't just teach technique. He instilled a philosophy. A belief that if you outwork everyone, if your conditioning is better, if your wrestling is deeper, if your mind is stronger, then no one can beat you. Not on your worst day. Not on their best day. Islam lived inside that philosophy. And then the training footage started to surface online. The first time most people outside the MMA world saw Islam Makhachev train, they didn't know what to make of it. It didn't look flashy. It didn't look like what you see in Hollywood movies where the hero does one-arm pull-ups and shadow boxes in slow motion while dramatic music plays. It looked like something else entirely.
It looked like a machine.
Islam drilling takedowns, but not just drilling them casually. Drilling them at full speed, full resistance, over and over and over again, with a level of precision that made it look effortless. Except it wasn't effortless. You could see the sweat. You could see the strain. But his technique never broke down. His form stayed perfect even when his body had every reason to quit. Then there was the grappling footage. Islam on the mat, working with training partners who were massive, experienced, dangerous wrestlers themselves, and he was controlling them,
moving them,
putting them exactly where he wanted them with a calm that seemed almost supernatural. And then the striking footage. This is where things got interesting. Because for a long time, critics of Islam said, okay, his wrestling is elite, but his striking is limited.
He's a grappler.
He relies on takedowns. If you can keep it standing, you have a chance. That was the theory. Then the training footage destroyed that theory completely. Because what people started seeing was an Islam Makhachev who had spent years quietly, methodically rebuilding his striking from the ground up.
Sharp combinations. Crisp timing.
Movement that looked nothing like a pure wrestler trying to learn how to box. It looked like a complete martial artist who understood distance, rhythm, angles. And Joe Rogan, who has been watching and commentating MMA for over 2 decades, who has seen virtually every great fighter train and compete, saw the footage. And he reacted the way he always does when something genuinely shocks him. He leaned forward, and his voice dropped, and he said, "This guy is on another level." He talked about how the footage showed not just skill but a kind of mastery that takes years to develop. He talked about how you can feel the difference between a fighter who has trained hard and a fighter who has trained smart and hard at the same time. He talked about how Islam moved with a completeness, wrestling, grappling, striking, cage work, conditioning, that reminded him of the very best fighters he had ever seen. And then he said something that every MMA fan needs to hear. He said the scariest part about Islam Makhachev is not what he shows you in a fight. The scariest part is what the training footage tells you about what's coming next. Because in training, you see the work before the result. You see the hours that go into a single technique. You see the version of a fighter that hasn't been released yet. And when Rogan watched Islam training, he saw a man who was still getting better. A man who was already a world champion, already the lightweight king of the world, and was still in the gym, still drilling, still refining, still pushing. That's the part that makes fighters nervous. It's one thing to lose to someone who is better than you right now. That's painful, but it's understandable. The best fighter wins. You accept it and you move on. But it's a completely different feeling to lose to someone who is already at the top, and is still improving. Because it means there may be no ceiling. And that brings us to something important. Something that gets lost sometimes in all the excitement around Islam Makhachev's rise.
The discipline.
Not just the physical discipline of showing up to train every day. That's important, but every professional athlete does that.
The discipline of the mind.
Islam Makhachev does not talk much. He is not someone you will see making viral social media posts, or trash-talking opponents at press conferences, or building a persona designed to attract attention.
He lets the work speak.
There is a story, and if you know the Dagestan fighting community, you've probably heard versions of it, about how Islam Makhachev approaches his off days. The days when there is no scheduled training, no camp, no fight preparation. And the story is that those days look almost exactly like his training days. Because for him, there is no real off day in the way most people imagine. There is rest. There is recovery. But there is always movement.
Always growth.
Always forward momentum. That kind of consistency is almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. Think about the most disciplined thing you have ever done in your own life. Maybe you woke up early every day for a month to work on something. Maybe you committed to a diet for a few weeks. Maybe you trained for a marathon. Now imagine doing something at that level, or harder, for 20 years.
Not a month. Not a year. 20 years.
That is what you are looking at when you see Islam Makhachev move. You are not watching natural talent. Well, there is natural talent, but that's not the point. You are watching the physical result of 2 decades of repetition, sacrifice, pain, focus, and belief. And the footage that made Joe Rogan stop mid-sentence, is just a small window into all of that. Now let's talk about what makes Islam's training specifically different. Because it's not just that he trains hard. Lots of fighters train hard.
The question is how.
The Dagestan system, the system that produced Khabib, that produced Islam, and that continues to produce elite fighters at a rate that baffles the rest of the martial arts world, is built on a specific foundation.
Volume and resistance.
In most Western training gyms, you learn a technique, you drill it a few times, and then you move on to sparring. You apply the technique in live situations. In the Dagestan system, you drill the technique until it lives in your body permanently. Until your nervous system has stored it so deeply that you cannot do it wrong even if you tried. Until the technique is not something you think about, it is something you simply do. And that drilling happens against resistance. Real resistance. Training partners who are not going easy on you. Training partners who are world-class wrestlers themselves, who are trying to stop you, who are pushing back with everything they have. So when you finally take that technique into a real fight, you have already done it against the hardest possible opposition. The fight is not harder than training. In many ways, the fight is easier. Because in the fight, there is a beginning and an end. In training, it just keeps going. Islam has lived in that system his entire life. And when you look at his training footage through that lens, when you understand what went into building every single thing you're watching, it starts to feel almost overwhelming. You're not watching a highlight. You're watching a Lee. Because in the fight, there is a beginning and an end. In training, it just keeps going. Islam has lived in that system his entire life. And when you look at his training footage through that lens, when you understand what went into building every single thing you're watching, it starts to feel almost overwhelming. You're not watching a highlight. You're watching a life's work in motion. And Joe Rogan understood that instantly. That's why his reaction was what it was. Because Rogan doesn't just watch the surface. He understands the layers. He has trained martial arts himself. He has spoken with the greatest coaches and athletes in the sport. He knows what it takes. And when he saw Islam, really saw him, he saw all of those layers. He saw the mountains of Dagestan. He saw the childhood drills. He saw Khabib pushing him, challenging him, refusing to let him be anything less than perfect. He saw Abdulmanap's philosophy embedded in every movement. He saw the years of quiet, unglamorous work that produced a champion who moves the way Islam moves. And he couldn't believe it. Not because it was impossible, but because it was the realest thing he had seen. Now, Islam Makhachev is the UFC lightweight champion. And the lightweight division, the 155-pound division, is widely considered the most competitive weight class in all of combat sports. The best fighters in the world fight at lightweight. The competition is brutal. The margin for error is zero. And Islam sits at the top of it and makes it look almost comfortable. His title defenses have been dominant. His opponents, world-class fighters, champions themselves in other organizations, people who have trained their entire lives, have been unable to solve him. Unable to keep him from doing exactly what he wants to do, exactly when he wants to do it. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because of what you see in the training footage. That happens because while everyone else is resting, Islam is drilling. While everyone else is satisfied with good enough, Islam is asking what comes next. While everyone else is watching footage of their opponents, Islam is in the gym making himself into a problem that no opponent can prepare for. And the terrifying thing, the thing that keeps lightweight fighters up at night, is that by every indication, he is not done improving. The man is still hungry. The footage shows it. The performances show it. The way he carries himself in and out of the cage shows it. There is no complacency. There is no moment where you can look at Islam Makhachev and think, okay, he's satisfied now. He's going to start coasting. It doesn't exist. And Joe Rogan, watching that training footage, understood something that maybe the general public hadn't fully grasped yet. This isn't just a great fighter at the top of his sport. This is something rarer than that. This is a man for whom greatness is not the goal. Greatness is just what happens when you live the way he lives. When you train the way he trains. When you refuse, every single day, to be anything less than everything you are capable of being. The footage didn't shock Joe Rogan because it was superhuman. It shocked him because it was undeniably, completely, almost uncomfortably human. It was the purest version of what a human being can become when they commit everything they have to a single pursuit. And that more than any highlight reel, more than any championship belt, more than any record or statistic. That is Islam Makhachev. That is what you are really watching when you watch him train. Not a fighter getting ready for a fight. A man who has already arrived at a place most people will never reach, and is still walking forward.